Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Stephen. This 2020 count. We're very grateful of you taking time to be with us, and we're grateful that our speakers are with us here as well. Just a quick updating here for some housekeeping points. At any time during the presentation on your screen, there is a section for you to type in a question. And if you type in that question on the dashboard, we'll pick up either throughout the webinar here or at the end when we go to questions and answers. We'll be able to respond to some of your questions. I really want to encourage the local officials, whether you're from a town or a county, whether you're in the planning department or a legislator or another official who's with us here today, please send in your questions so that we could, your question will be not only valuable to yourself and your community, but it will also help others around the state. So please submit questions throughout the presentation today or at the end. We have with us a couple of officials from the state who will be making some presentations. Rich Toby will be speaking about some updates on the Census 2020, and the state of New York has been following this very closely along with the federal government. We have Mr. Frank Winters will be with us to talk about the LUCA, the local addresses appeal process is underway, and he will be discussing that. We'll also hear some information about new construction and housing, and also hear from some new complete count models that are in place from Rebecca Sen from the Health and Welfare Council of Long Island, and how these models are helping counties and community agencies with toolkits. So that'll be the purpose of today's session, and we're grateful again that you are with us. And just briefly before I turn it over to Rich Toby is why we care about the census. I mean, obviously, understanding who is in the United States is very important for the federal government, but it's very important for our political representation in the United States Congress, as the congressional representation is divided based on the proportion in the House. So our number of House of Representatives seats hinge on the number of people in our state, and Congress determines how federal resources are allocated. So really the second main point outside of political representation is the regional populations or the state populations determines how a full range of federal grants and funds are spent for health and human service programs, for public safety, research, and billions of other federal dollars flowing to the states and in our state to the counties as we deliver many of these health and human services programs at the regional level in New York. New York State is, at the last census, was in the third most populous state ranking, but Florida has been edging away at that spot, and it's very important for New York to maintain its status and its population and to make sure that every vote is counted. So with that as a background, it's my pleasure to introduce the governor's main person, the point person on the 2020 census, Mr. Rich Toby. Rich is a former Erie County Deputy County Executive and a board member of the New York State Association of Counties. We've worked very closely with Rich on local updates to Census Addresses, also known as LUCA, a campaign that engaged every county in a historic fashion in New York State to make sure that each household is counted in next year's count. So Rich Toby, let me turn it over to you, and then you can introduce Mr. Frank Winters, the Geographic Information Officer for the New York State Office of Information Technology Services.
Steve, thank you very much, and thank you again for NISAC's terrific cooperation with the state on the census matter. We've been working together since 2017, and I think we're really seeing terrific results, particularly with LUCA, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. I want to mention just briefly 3 items and then some late-breaking news, which I think is of interest to everyone. So for the LUCA appeal process, Frank Winters will be talking about what to do as the information begins to come in from the Census Bureau as to which addresses have been accepted and which have not for inclusion within the census. We've heard that overall, through the efforts of the counties, New York City, and then many of the municipalities throughout New York State, the Census Bureau has already accepted from us, all of us together, 225,000 net new addresses. It's a terrific result, and so I want to thank everyone who's participated in this. Cornell University was a big partner, but it was really the hard work of state officials doing their big data work and of the local governments on the ground checking this out. We couldn't have done it as effectively as we have without the cooperation of NYSAC and of the counties and so many of the other local governments. So thank you for that. Next, but Frank will go through the nuts and bolts of what's going to happen next. I want to mention new construction very quickly. That's a process by which the Census Bureau invites governments that have registered, previously registered, to identify structures that have been built between 2018 and essentially Census Day in 2020 that were not otherwise included within the databases that the Census Bureau was using to do the enumeration. It's not much of an issue for counties because by and large counties don't issue building permits or certificates of occupancy, but it is for the cities, towns, and villages, and surprisingly it is also for the state, where the state issues its own building documents for buildings that it constructs and sometimes that it finances, such as the Dormitory Authority. But if you do participate in the new construction process, particularly for the cities and towns and villages, and you yourself have not registered, or your county has not registered, we want to let you know that there's still an opportunity to get that information before the Census Bureau by supplying it to New York State. We're prepared. We have registered. We're prepared to submit it on your behalf if there's new construction that you want us to have the Census Bureau look at. The rule is it's got to have had a roof, walls, windows, and doors by December 31st of this year and ready for occupancy, or not necessarily occupied, by April 1st of 2020. So if you've got structures that are new, and that not only includes built from the ground new buildings, but also conversions, where a building was once industrial or commercial and now has residential in it, please go through the process of having it included, and if we can help you, please reach out to us, and there's contact information that will follow. But now the late-breaking news. We have been urging all of our contacts, but particularly those in local governments, to help get people hired by the Census Bureau to fill the many, many roles that the Census Bureau will be hiring or attempting to hire between now and the end of the enumeration process next summer. They're going to be hiring hundreds of thousands of people in New York State. It's very ambitious, and they're not only having trouble hiring people, and we should help, but more importantly, it's in our interest to see that the right person gets hired. People who know the communities, who know the people, who speak the language, who know the issues in the neighborhoods. And hopefully that if we get a lot of people hired and the right ones, we'll naturally get a better count. The news is this, that the Census Bureau, or the federal government, excuse me, has authorized New York State to continue to grant benefits for people who have income-eligible programs, such as SNAP, TANF, Medicaid, and HEAP, for their census income to not be counted against the person with regard to an eligibility question or a benefits question. So someone who is now receiving a form of assistance can be hired by the Census Bureau, keep all of the census income that they earn, and not have their other benefits negatively affected. The Department, the New York State Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance has notified its network of county officials who provide these assistance, but we think this information is not broadly disseminated yet, and we hope you will do so. We've got a letter which makes this official. As of May 1st, these new rules have gone into effect. The only caveat that I want to mention is that the Census Bureau employment must be temporary. If somebody's on been hired for a year-round job with the Census Bureau, this doesn't count. Good for them. They've got a good job. Their benefits should be affected negative. You know, should have their benefit levels reduced. But if it's a temporary census job, even if it's 40 hours a week for the short duration of the census, they can keep all of their income or benefits for HEAP, Medicaid, TANF, and SNAP, food stamps. So with that, and we have the letter to that effect, and NISAC will have it, and we'll make it available to anyone who wants it. So kind of rushed through a lot, but I'd like to turn this over now to Frank Winter, who's going to go through the LUCA appeals process with a slideshow. So Frank, you're up.
That's great. Thank you, Rich. Happy to be here. So if I will cover the LUCA appeals process and the new construction program. Those are two separate but related programs. If you're involved in those programs, then you'll find this useful. The slide deck will be available with more copious notes than I have time to go through right now. If you're not involved directly with those processes, this will give you a feel for the hard work that your colleagues are doing and a bit of appreciation there. So first, the local update of census address. That's a program, Rich mentioned that 225,000 addresses have already been updated and improved through your participation, so that's wonderful news. And this appeal process is in legislation. So the Office of Management and Budget is the agency that has the lead on the appeals process. And the LUCA feedback is happening right now. Participants have 45 days to submit their appeals, and then OMB makes the final decision. And their decision is final, and we're expecting that January 2020. So the materials will be rolled out in the order grouped by the type of material. So if the submission was all paper, those come first, and they work their way through the more digital forms as they continue. One very important thing to remember is that all of this data, the appeals and the replies, is all covered by Title 13. So if that's new to you, that's the requirement that stresses the confidentiality, and all the participants have signed a letter that commits them to keeping this data confidential. So that's super important. So who can appeal? So the LUCA participants, the folks that submitted LUCA updates, are the first folks that would be eligible to appeal. Others that are eligible are those that have certified that the master address file was correct in their area. So if they certified that everything was okay, they still have an opportunity to work on some appeals, and we'll get into what that means in a minute. The master address file, to me, that's the backbone of the census. That's the data file that starts the whole process. So super important to get this right. What can we appeal? Certainly the additions and the corrections. If census has rejected those, we'll get into the specifics as to what type of rejection those might be. If census already has an address, then that's kind of good news. That is a New York State citizen who's going to get the form. Be careful on those type of rejections, however, to make sure that it's the sub-address. Is it apartment 12? Do we go down to that level of specificity? Those are the things to watch for on the appeals where census claims to already have the address. So what to appeal on the deletion side? Deletions are still important, removing some of the haystack from the needles, but also it's interesting that the master address file is continuously updated by census outside of the LUCA process. So there may be deletions that have happened by, just through a course of census's normal business, and multiple levels of government participate in the same geography. So we may have deletions by one level of government and corrections by another, which all will be sorted out through this. So deletions are an important part. So the census materials, you'll be maybe comforted to know that the same materials you used for submissions, the same formats, will come back to you in appeals. So it'll be familiar to you. And there will be 4 categories of information. There'll be a summary report, there'll be a detailed feedback address list, address by address, and that's where the real work gets done. And then there's address count lists and feedback materials. So the summary report, the number of additions, corrections, deletions, and so forth that were processed, the detailed feedback address list. These are the 4 fields that will appear. The first one will be blank, and that will be the appeal flag, and that is, of these, the only one that census participants that those doing the appeal will enter, and you just simply put a Y in the line in the record for any address you wish to appeal. And then the LUCA action is the action that was taken previously by the participant as part of the LUCA program, and the feedback code is the action that was taken by census. So the next important feedback is the count by census geography, by lots of levels of census geography, and this is a before and after count of housing units and group quarters before and after the effects of the appeals process. The 2 most important feedback codes, this is from the census field where they communicate what action they've taken. X01 and R03 are the 2 codes which make a record eligible for appeal. If the address was accepted, there's no need to appeal. X01 means that the address was deleted by another level of government. So we're on to a different research and a different appeals process for that. And the R03 is the rejection. These links will provide really good details, more than we have time to go into today, but I'll highlight the bottom one. The geographic partnership software, the update software, the GUPS program is one of the central tools used in LUCA and in the appeals, and there's a YouTube video link there on the use of GUPS. So what to provide to OMB? First, contact information, and then the appealed address information, supporting documentation. We'll cover more on that in just a minute. The address appeal information, the complete address, house number, and the unit number, critically important to get those sub-addresses, street name and zip code. The census provided IDs to track the process. The participants' action codes, census action codes, and the latitude and longitude, clearly part of that. Now on to the supporting documentation. Supporting documentation is a written explanation of what action we recommend be taken, and then a detailed description of the sources. And we'll get into that in just a minute. And then other supporting evidence, and we'll cover that in 2 slides. So the sources, the date of the address source is very important, but the frequency of update also important. The methods used and the quality assurance, this is for the supporting sources. And then why was this data collected in the first place? Chances are a lot of the source documents that we have are originated for other business purposes. An explanation of that will certainly help, and all those go to add credibility to strengthen the appeal. Sources that really go to evidence of supporting evidence that there is a residence is occupancy permits and provision of utilities, land use, photography, the state's orthophotography program, or even street view photography that shows evidence, 911 listings, tax records, and don't rule out site inspection, interviews, residents, neighborhoods. As local governments go, you might see, hey, I passed that on my way to work, and it clearly is a new housing unit there. So preparing the materials, the first thing we're going to do is drop a Y in the appeal flag for every record that you do want to appeal. And then the sources that support that will be supplied either in a written narrative field or with supporting documents. And then, of course, if there is GIS data that's provided, that will be provided in separate documents. There's a very specific file naming, not to be intimidating, because this file naming convention will follow through the whole LUCA process. In this case, the XXX is the file extension, depending on the type of material that you sent in for the LUCA process in the first place, PDF or CSV, for instance. Good news is that if you have 100 addresses to appeal, you don't need to send 100 of these files. You would list all of the addresses in each of these files, and it would communicate your thoughts on all 100 addresses. And they all get zipped up. The whole submission will be encrypted, and this isn't really anything to worry about as long as we just follow the process through, because the initial feedback from Census will come following password and username. You'll get a couple days ahead of time. You'll unzip that encrypted file. You will do your work, and then you'll add your files right back into that same zip file using those same credentials. So it'll flow right through. Your submission must go to LUCA staff, and kind of interesting, if there is considered a tie between Census Bureau and the LUCA participant wins. If there is a tie between disagreement in different levels of government, the lower or more home rule level of government wins. The final results, there will be a brief explanation from OMB, but the OMB decision is final, and the appeals process, like we said, will wrap up in January. So we have 45 days. This is starting now. The submissions are rolling out. You should see your materials soon in that order of document type that I mentioned earlier. In preparation, you can certainly document your data sources. You can prepare the quality assurance information, and you can start to think about the strategies. You probably already have started to think about the low fruit, which addresses are most likely to be accepted and at which level of effort. Important contact information on the OMB appeals process. There's information, email and phone, and the GUPS software right there. So let me shift gears and talk about new construction. And the new construction program has already started and will continue to identify any potential housing units. And I use the word potential because they don't need to be inhabited. They don't have to have evidence, but if someone could be living there April 1st. And the term inhabitable is really if it has doors, windows, and a roof. So the registration for new construction has passed. That was June 2019. And participants can use GUPS or GIS files or PDF maps through the format that is in the guidance. But the good news for anyone that feels like they might be left out and know of new construction or would like to research new construction, the state has, in the State Data Center, has applied to be a participant in new construction. So you can feed your information. We'll give you contact information to provide your new construction evidence right to the state. So we'll have the whole state covered. 21 counties are not registered, but the yellow on the map shows the coverage that the state is willing to provide. So please take advantage of that. Schedule on new construction, really starting in September. We'll have, again, 45 calendar days to report. There will be training webinars in both September and October, and a December closeout. The training webinars are listed here. The ones in New York are September 19th and 25th. And then in October, October 1st, 4th, 7th, and 9th. Preparation really is identifying any new construction that was underway March 2018. So that coincides with the LUCA process. And is expected to be habitable April 1st. to ensure that all the addresses that we might canvass are picked up. And remember that part of the census count is housing units and households. Those unoccupied housing units are also a good part of the census data, which gets propagated for 10 years. The GOID, or the latitude, longitude, certainly an important consideration there. Your submission will follow the really quite well specified reporting guidelines, and those are all listed on the URL there. And contact information, again, for GUPS and the new construction program, and then most importantly for those who have not signed up, the New York State Data Center email and phone number. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Rebecca Sanin, and President and CEO of Health and Welfare Commission of Long Island, Council of Long Island. So Rebecca.
Hi, thank you very much. As you said, I am the President and CEO of the Health and Welfare Council of Long Island, and we are an umbrella organization for the nonprofit sector in our region. So we work across every area of health and human services, and the census has been at the forefront of our efforts for the last several months. And I'm happy to share with you today what we're doing. Essentially, we've built a census army for our region, a model that is able to be replicated across New York State. And I've already been working with counties across the state to help them to do the work they need to do to get this moving, because it is so important that we achieve an accurate count. So I'm going to go over today the task at hand, some of the challenges to a complete count, the impact of the 2020 census, what we've done on Long Island to create this campaign, some lessons learned, and next steps. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end. Next slide, please. So the task at hand, I'm sorry, you can go to the next slide. The task at hand, it's never too early to begin campaigning for a complete count. The sense of urgency that we have is right now. And so we're getting questions all the time about why in 2019 we're working on, Census 2020. And quite frankly, we have a very heavy lift in front of us in order to get an accurate count, particularly given that this is a every 10-year effort. And so a lot of folks are not tuned in and are not paying attention to the census. In 2010, only 75.8% of the state's households mailed back their 2010 census questionnaire, requiring more costly and difficult in-person follow-ups to enumerate the remaining 24.2%. And let's be honest, in 2020, it's a different climate than it was in 2010, and many people will not respond to a knock at the door. So we need to work very hard to make sure that folks are completing their census early in the process so that they don't have to be exposed to any kind of follow-up. And achieving a complete count is a huge task. And as I said, we're living in a time when distrust of government is high in many of our hard-to-count communities. So the effort is a big lift. So in terms of identifying challenges to a complete count, there's several. Certainly, there's a lack of federal funding. When you look back at what happened in 2010, this process has already been slower to roll out than in the past. At the state level, the Fiscal Policy Institute indicated that New York State needed $40 million to achieve an accurate count to do the work that's needed. The Senate and Assembly put it in the budget. The final budget ended on up to $20 million. So there is an issue around funding, and it's why it's so important to look at leveraging existing resources. There's a digital divide, both in terms of access and literacy, and this is the first census where most people, when they hear from the Census Bureau for the first time, are going to be given a link to go online to complete the census. And of course, we have many concerns about this, certainly for our senior population, concerns about scams, concerns regarding digital access. And so it's important to know that folks can complete the census in paper form, online, or also on the phone. And on the phone, there will be 13 languages available, so that could be particularly meaningful for some of our non-English speaking communities. The anti-immigrant sentiment and climate of fear and distrust of government is something that I think is really going to be the biggest challenge around getting folks to complete the census. Those of us in health and human services know that people are really living invisible lives right now intentionally for fear of scrutiny and family dissolution. And we know that there have been major demographic shifts in our state since 2010. Certainly in my region alone, just as a small example, Over 10,500 unaccompanied children have made Long Island their home since 2014. So that was not a population shift that could have been predicted in 2010, which means that the dollars didn't follow for that population shift. So we need to make sure we do everything we can to address this climate of fear and to talk to folks about Title 13, which was mentioned earlier, which protects them. A lack of affordable housing is another issue that we face in many communities across the state. It means lots and lots of people live in houses that are meant for one family, but you may have 5 or 10 families in a single family house. You may have multiple families in apartments, which means not everybody is going to hear from the Census Bureau. So we really need to make sure we're engaging in a campaign for self-selection, that if folks have not heard from the Census Bureau by April 1st, that they get on the phone and call the Census Bureau and say, I'm here and I want to be counted. And a lack of understanding as to just how much the census impacts. This has been a very huge moment of learning for me as I have gone across the state and across the region talking to professional groups about the census. How many people whose business models are directly affected don't know the financial impact of the census? They know the political impact, but they don't know the financial impact. So we have a lot of work to do to educate people. Next slide, please. The impact of the census in terms of representation and the health of our democracy. Certainly I know folks involved in NISAC know this, but the census determines our representatives, and a complete count in 2020 is really necessary for us to have our representation in government. If New York sees just a 0.6% undercount, we stand to lose another 2 seats, and that's really significant. We need to be adequately represented in Washington, D.C. When you think about things like the changes to the state and local tax deduction, when you think about appropriations around Superstorm Sandy and the impact in our state, we realize we really need to have a strong voice in Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. The impact of the census on federal funding and the health of our communities is something that so few people understand, that the census truly impacts all of the building blocks of healthy communities. And if what we want is public health, if we want public safety, if we want to preserve our communities, the single most important thing a government entity can do, the single most important thing a parent can do or a community member can do is to make sure that there's an accurate count in 2020. A complete count means that New York communities will receive our fair share of funding and resources. And the truth is, New York State is the purse strings for much of the rest of the country. And so if we want to have downward pressure on our taxes and our cost of living, then we really need to make sure we receive an accurate count. Next slide, please. So the impact of census is something that I think is really important to communicate. First, you need to build meaningful connections between census data and funding for issues that are critical to the community. So we like to give this example over here about potholes. Do you want a pothole filled in Texas, or do you want it filled on the New York State Thruway? If the answer is the New York State Thruway, which I'm sure it is, we need to make sure that folks complete the census, because infrastructure and our roads and so many services are impacted by census data. Overcrowding in schools. We have an example on Long Island of a school district that had an undercount in 2010, used that data to do their projections. School registration started, lots more children registered than they had anticipated, and they ended up having to rent out space in an adjoining school district to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is in a very under-resourced school district that really needed those dollars to be invested into programs for children. So it has a huge impact on our schools, on access to healthcare, and on our cost of living. Really important to make it personal. So building the Long Island Complete Count community, first of all, it's really important to recognize that this is a partnership between government and the nonprofit communities and business and other stakeholders as well. So if you have a nonprofit or an organization that is a natural convener, an organization like mine that is an umbrella agency or that is known for bringing people together to solve complex problems, you want to make sure you're partnering with them to really establish a strong Complete Count committee. And so we met with our county executives to establish both committees. We're working very closely with our elected representatives. It's very important to raise public awareness and to start that effort now. So we held press conferences for the launch of our Complete Count committees and to respond to issues that the census has an impact on. So for example, the citizenship question, as well as when we're talking about other issues, the impact of census data on those health and human service issues. Making sure that you include census information in all forums I can't speak enough about this. Each of you has a platform. As government officials, you have platforms, whether it's, making speeches in your community, whether it's your social media, using that platform to educate the community. Truly, census can be built into any speech. I gave a talk to one of our unions recently at a big event, and it was supposed to be about the anniversary of Medicaid, and Medicaid is one of the top funded programs where census data is used in terms of the formula for funding. So it's really easy to take census data and include it into any topic that you're talking about, but to use those platforms. To be creative, one of the things we did here at the bottom of the slide, you see the Long Island 2020 Census logo. That was created by a high school student. And so we did a region-wide high school contest for students to present logos that they would recommend our region use for branding our work. And 133 students across Long Island, submitted logos. And so that's a great thing because it meant that they were going home and talking to their parents about it. It meant that there was a buzz being created. And so much of building an army is really about building momentum. So be creative, think about ways to include census information in everything you do, but also to really create new engagement. We had the Commissioner of Labor here last week speaking to some of our census partners. We're always looking for ways to reach out to the Census Commission and to make sure we're keeping that engagement alive. And then part of engagement is always continuous convening. Because this is something that happens every 10 years, people are not tuned into it, and so they need to be engaged continually in order to create that momentum. Next slide, please. So building the Long Island Complete Count Committee. So the model that we've created, what we've done is we've created leaders, we've convened them across all sectors for meetings for the Complete Count Committee. And so what we've done is we've looked at business, childcare and early education, community-based organizations, elected officials, faith-based institutions, labor unions, legal advocates, library systems, local government systems. Many of you know Long Island has, so many localized level of government systems, healthcare, media outlets, schools and universities, and transportation services. So we immediately reached out to all the leaders in these various areas. Next slide, please. And so then what we did was we identified subcommittees and co-chairs. And so we've examined what groups have historically been undercounted in our region and what systems exist that can help us to reach Long Islanders. And we created 11 subcommittees to serve as focus work groups. And these subcommittees, I just need to say, as someone who worked in government for a long time, I know there's lots of advisory boards and councils and task forces, and these are not yet another board. These are really truly working committees. So you need to think carefully about the leaders that you have co-chair them, because they need to be people who can really motivate folks and inspire folks to want to do this work. Next slide, please. And so this is what we did. We said that historically undercounted groups facing barriers to a complete count in 2020 include the early childhood community. Children 0 to 5 are historically undercounted in the decennial census. They were particularly undercounted in 2010. And just to be clear, if you were to think about it this way, if there's a 2-year-old in your household that isn't counted, your school district wouldn't get funding for that child's presence until after they were done with elementary school. And so early childhood is really key. Children are overrepresented as a group living in poverty. They are often living in hard to count communities. So really targeting early childhood communities and providers is one of the reasons why we created an early childhood subcommittee. Immigrant subcommittees, we have one for both of our counties because the issues are different in both of our counties. Want to be clear that when we talk about the immigrant community, it's a very diverse community. And so targeting and strategy around messaging needs to be tested and not assumed. People of color, as an underrepresented group in 2010, we need to make sure that we're reaching out to people of color. So we have a subcommittee focused there. We have a subcommittee focused on senior citizens. And then the other subcommittees are what we call delivery systems. So the business community. So we have a subcommittee that's chaired, for example, by Libby and the Long Island Association. We have a communications subcommittee, which is charged with testing messages and building platforms, building social media graphics, doing as much work around communication opportunity as possible for all the other subcommittees. We have an education subcommittee, and that is chaired by 2 superintendents in our region. And the reason why that is so important is that school districts have the data about where children are multiply registered. So while we don't know when there's 10 families in a single unit, school districts do. And so while they can't share that information, they can certainly think about it and use it in terms of their own outreach strategies, because the census affects Title I and Title III and school lunches and special education and so many things that impact the trajectory of children's development. Faith-based subcommittee, and that is made up of folks from every faith and really focused on how the faith-based community can leverage their platform to get folks to complete the census, and especially in a time when there's this distrust, building that trust within their communities. And then local government, which is really important because we want to make sure that our local government is thinking about all the different places that they touch constituents and really working together to create best practices. Next, please. So building stakeholder engagement, we've supplied our partners with data about programs and dollars that census affects, as well as maps of towns that were hard to count in 2020. And this is really important when you think about creating war rooms and being able to track. The Census Bureau is going to be updating on a nightly basis tracks that are completing, what the percentage of completion rate looks like. And so you want to be able to track that and do your outreach in a targeted and effective way. But being able to look at the maps and understand what was hard will be helpful as well. So we want to give people lots of information and data. Providing education and training for stakeholders is something that we've been doing and continue to do. I've been speaking to all the different associations of superintendents, unions, local municipal government, all different kinds of leaders, but as well as folks who are on the ground who are going to be doing outreach, really making sure we're giving them the education they need so they can speak with confidence about the census. Next slide, please. Next, what's important is to convene subcommittees to build an outreach plan. So we continue to work with robust subcommittees to address specific challenges of those hard to count groups and to coordinate strategies across existing systems. So you need to identify key messages that will resonate with residents of your region. For this reason, we held a communications retreat with our communications subcommittee that lasted a full day, where work was done on messaging, and then we brought in co-chairs of the different subcommittees to test the messaging that was developed and see what the feedback looked like. Having key events, making sure you're using every communication channel that you can to spread the word about the census. Having members of your complete count committees actually have assignments so that they understand what they're responsible for, and so that we're tracking the work as we go forward. One of the things that we built is an outreach tracker so that folks can register with us as they are doing outreach events in the community, because we want to make sure that one community isn't saturated to the neglect of another. We also created a material request form to make sure folks are getting what they need, a frequently asked question report, which we did in concert with the Nassau County Comptroller's Office. And I'm happy to share certainly all of these materials with folks on the call through NISAC at some point. Next, please. So what are the lessons learned thus far? The importance of leveraging existing systems and addressing funding shortages. So we can't, sort of stay frustrated by the lack of funding for census. We need to act now, and we can't wait. So one of the things that we've done is we've created an email pledge that is in, our signatures on our emails, and that we've asked all of our hundreds and hundreds of partners to include in their email signatures, where folks can click on and fill out that they pledge to complete the census in April of 2020. And this now allows us to capture their cell phone information and their email, so we can text and email them and remind them as we get closer, and remind them of the importance to their community. We've created, as I said, an email signature that everybody's using. We've asked people to include information about census on pay stubs, on subsidy checks that they send out, on bills. Every way in which you touch constituents, the opportunity is there. We recommend, one of the biggest lessons learned for me has been assuming that stakeholders are uninformed about the impact of census on their business model and daily lives. Very few people realize that it's a 10-year funding precedent, that it's really only 10 questions, and that they're not hard to complete. So it's very important to do everything you can to raise up that level of education, to raise all boats, to harness the empowerment and inclusion aspects of the census, to give stakeholders a sense of agency. This is an opportunity to really empower people to, stand up for their communities. And so certainly we need to be doing that as much as we can. And Title 13 needs to be messaged effectively. And that's a really big issue for our immigrant community, certainly to feel safe in sharing their information. But it's an issue for other folks as well. For example, landlords, that if you rent a space to more people than you're supposed to have in that house, and that if you share that information with the Census Bureau, if you count those families, that information cannot be used against you with county or town, permitting violations. Next slide, please. So we've developed tools, as I said before, that can be utilized statewide and adapted to address specific regional challenges. As I said, a frequently asked questions report was really important to us to develop because there were just questions that were being asked over and over. And so we've been handing this out everywhere we go. We're building toolkits for census ambassadors across different sectors. So as I said several times, we're building an army. That is an army of census ambassadors who are speaking about census everywhere that they go and at every opportunity, including, family barbecues on the weekend. But we're creating toolkits for the different sectors. So for example, if you're a hospital, what can you do to promote the census? If you're a school district, if you're a faith-based institution, we want those to be shared everywhere. They are easy to replicate so that folks know what they need to do and can get to the work of doing it. The Census Pledge and email signature and outreach tracker I mentioned before. We created a material request tool because we want to make sure that we're coordinating effectively. And we're asking people what they did, what the scope was of their outreach, and any material that they need to follow up. Next. So next steps for us, we are organizing a series of trainings, including Census 101, digital security, and how to get out the count. We're building local citizen advisory councils to make sure that the regional momentum reaches all hard-to-count communities across Long Island, both at the very grassroots level as well as at a coordinated organizational level. Subcommittee work groups are continuing to meet every month to strategize for further research and further outreach. And we have very specific things that local government can do to be helpful, things like identifying how much of the budget is based on census data, which is something that you can, share with your constituents, using social media and communication channels to amplify the importance of the census. It was mentioned earlier, but really spotlighting canvasser recruitment, because these are jobs that pay $17 to $23 an hour. They're temporary, but there's paid training and flexible hours. And, we're much more likely to open our door if it's somebody that we know at the door. So we want to make sure people in communities are really the ones knocking on doors. The messenger matters as much as the message. Using public-facing officials and events to spread the word about the importance of getting out the count, identifying hard-to-count tracks in your jurisdiction, and identifying key leaders to share information. And so that isn't just an elected official or an organization head, it's the person in a community that's hard to count, that people rely on, that they call, when they have a sick child and they don't know what to do. You need to identify those folks and help them to become strong census ambassadors as well. And then using things like your governmental calendars for recycling or your school district calendars to highlight the census. On Long Island, we have our school districts designating April as census month on their calendars so that parents see that that's really something that impacts their schools and is important. Sharing census information with local licensing, consumer affair mailings, paychecks, training constituent affairs staff in talking points so that they can share information about Census 2020, making sure you have signage in your frequently trafficked areas. If you have a passport office or a place where there's a lot of traffic, to make sure you have signage about the importance of Census 2020, and making sure that you're using things like town hall meetings. If you spend 1.5 minutes at the beginning of every meeting talking about the importance of Census 2020 to your region, to your community, it really does make a difference and start to build the momentum and to build the army that needs to be built. Next slide, please. And so finally, look, we all benefit when we all count. All New Yorkers need to be counted in 2020. I'm more than happy to share more about this model and share resources with you. This is my contact information. Very happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much. That's the end of my presentation.
I'm not sure if we have some questions. Again, all this information from Ms. Sannon and Mr. Winters will be posted on our website, and that will be available starting tomorrow. And you can see on the context slide here how to reach Ms. Sannon. She did cover quite a bit of information on the local count committees and the toolkit that was developed for Long Island, and we're very grateful that Rebecca was here with us to share that, and then we'll also distribute that around the state. A lot of good ideas there, especially April being Census Count Month, and to proclaim that by the counties and local governments and school districts and really do this push beginning in April of 2020. So just a few questions. We'll try to wrap up on the hour here. Can we use signage in a post office? That's a question that came in, signage in a post office. Mr. Toby.
Because the post offices are federal government facilities, they'll have to decide that. But they're all agencies are supposed to cooperate with the census, and we'll raise this question with the Census Bureau. But I do want to make this point that New York State has planned to use all state agencies as venues to promote the census. And so we've got all state agencies preparing plans. The Department of Labor, for instance, with 96 outreach centers, will be posting signs. They'll be making computers available for people to do enumeration on site. We'll have trained staff. Local governments are so different, each from the other and from the state, but they also have opportunities. And so, for instance, we think clerks' offices are terrific places in which town, village, county clerks, where census information can be assembled. And for some clerks, it might be possible to make computers available for people who come in to transact normal business with the clerk to actually go online right then and be enumerated. But if that's not in some communities' best interest, they don't feel they can do it, the clerks are usually information central. And if they can't do it in those offices, they'll know where to go. The library down the street's doing it. There's a government office somewhere else that's doing it. You can go here or there. And so getting a local plan in which the information ends up in the clerk's office and in the chief elected official's office and all the elected officials' offices is part of a complete count committee plan. And it's easy enough to do. Everybody should be operating at that level. Even if you can't do all the things that we just heard about on Long Island, it's certainly possible to do some of them.
Okay, if you have questions, now would be the time to submit them, and we'll take them up. Here's another question, Mr. Toby. Who do people contact for temporary jobs? How do the local officials inform the public about these temporary jobs? Do they have to be a certain age, 18 years and older? Are there any qualifications? We heard that individuals can keep their public assistance if they are temporarily employed. So where's the go-to contact? Can we send some information out
Sure.
To the local governments?
Sure. The starting point is the Census Bureau has a website. It's 2020census.gov/jobs. Anyone who's interested in applying can just go to that site and fill out a pretty easy form. I'm told it takes only 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. No resume is required. You do have to be 18, but you have to be 18 when you start the job. If you're 17 now, you can still fill it out. And when you turn 18, they may contact you. You do have to be a U.S. citizen, but we think that there may be a waiver to allow non-citizens who are otherwise lawfully entitled to work in the United States, who have special skills, particularly language skills, may also be employed. These jobs are very, very flexible. It's a terrific second job for somebody. You can do it after hours, weekends, evenings. You are not expected to go to a regular office. Your assignments will come to you at home, and you can go from there on a route to knock on doors of people who you are instructed to see the next day. There's paid training, so you'll be trained, and during the training period, you'll be paid by the Census Bureau. Most of the training can be done from home, not all of it, but most of it. The Census Bureau has said that they'll likely be supplying laptops or I don't know, Palm Pilots or some type of communication device that you would use for the job. And we think they're ideal jobs for retired people, seniors, teachers off over the summer, a good source of secondary income, and very, very flexible.
Okay, the next question that we have is sort of a basic yet very important question. When does the count officially start, and when does it end?
The count is, it's a little confusing, I must admit, but the census day in the United States is April 1st of 2020. But the count will actually start quite a bit sooner than that, particularly for certain programs. So there's a program having to do with group quarters where they'll be counting people in dormitories and nursing homes and other places. That's likely to start in February. The mailing of the form that will tell you how to go online and be enumerated is scheduled to start being mailed on March 12th of 2020. So it really starts for most people in March, even though April is the official kickoff. It will run through the summer. We've not been told what the exact termination date is, but we're guessing it will run through August and perhaps into September.
Is this an electronic census, Mr. Toby? Are individuals supposed to be completing the attestation that they're here online, or is it a paper, or is it both?
The answer is yes. For the first time, the Census Bureau is trying to do as much of the enumeration as they can online. So almost everybody, but not all people, will be given an opportunity to go online, complete the census. For each individual, it's 10 questions. Should be pretty quick. If you have a large household, it'll take longer because 10 questions for each person. But you go online and do it. But if you don't wish to do it online, you can request a paper form, or you can actually do it by calling a phone number, and they will do the enumeration over the telephone. You'll need a little bit of information, but mostly just your address, and then you could do it that way. And then finally, if you don't do any of those things, it's likely that a person will come to your door, a census enumerator, who will have identification, knock on the door, and help you fill out the form right there at your doorstep.
Mr. Toby, how will the local government officials know if their new addresses that they submitted pursuant to LUCA have been accepted? You mentioned earlier that there were 225,000. The state submitted nearly 1,900,000, perhaps some duplications between all of the submissions. But how will the local governments know if they were accepted, those new addresses?
Yeah, so first, when you say the state, that's right, but it's all of us together, not just the state government that submitted the 900,000. So that's the number. But I'd like Frank to answer that question about how they'll know and what happens.
Sure. So you're right on that there most certainly is duplication, and in a perfect world, it would be almost 100% duplication. A local government and the state would have identified the same addresses. But in the feedback form, each census participant will get a list of all the addresses that they sent in the detailed feedback address list file. And there's a field feedback underbar code, and that has, I highlighted the X01 and R03 codes for someone else deleted this or we rejected, but the codes for all the different type of acceptance will also be in there. So you'll see record by record in a sortable file if you do electronic. You see exactly what was accepted.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Winters. The next question that we have here, we're just a little over our hour now here, is who can local government officials call in the state of New York as a contact, as a reference?
They can call us. We'll be happy to speak.
So who is the us?
Okay, so my name is Richard Toby. My phone number is 518-708-7572. We'll be happy to speak to local governments about how we can all work together. Are
you at the Department of State?
I'm at Department of Labor.
Department of Labor.
Right.
Okay, so they can contact the Department of Labor, Richard Toby.
Yep.
Okay, building on what Rebecca did in Long Island with the fairly extensive community-based agencies and toolkits and the elaborate committees that she has established for both Nassau and Suffolk counties, a very sophisticated operation there. What if counties or local governments in the rest of the state are not as resourceful as these efforts on Long Island? Is there something that that local governments can do as an in-between step between the excellent work on Long Island. That may be occurring around the state as well, but what about in the smaller rural counties to make sure that these votes or people are counted?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. First of all, there are over 100 complete count committees that have now been formed in New York State. We think we're up to about 115 now, and they're all different. That some are county-wide, some are city-wide, some are city and county together. Some of them are small geographies. There's one that's just a single census tract that we're aware of in Troy. There's very interesting things that are taking place. Many of them are ethnic or religious or language oriented, where the committee is based upon a commonality of a cultural trait or a language or common geography. And obviously they all need not do the same things. That the common denominator is that they can serve as a trusted voice in helping people become enumerated, in be counted. And we think that as many of them as can be should be formed, that we also hope that there'll be a coordination effort. And we think a county coordinating effort is a good way to go, but if that's not in the cards, or if it's two counties together, or if it's something else, it's all okay. That that we want to see these formed and people working together. And one of the terrific things about what we've just heard on Long Island is that they've provided a toolkit, but it's a menu. It's not a thing in which you've got to do all of those things. You can pick the one that feels good for you. You can learn from what's being done elsewhere. And that toolkit, along with other materials that the state will be providing and the Census Bureau has provided, are all suggestions. Do what's best for you. Doing an enumeration in an agricultural community with perhaps a lot of Amish is very, very different than doing an enumeration in a place in, say, Washington Heights, where a lot of people are from the Dominican Republic and speak Spanish. It's vastly different, and the plans have to be shaped.
Okay, well, that will conclude. Trying to stay within our hour, I want to thank the officials from the New York State Office of Information Technology Services, the New York State Department of Labor, and the Health and Welfare Council of Long Island. That will conclude today's webinar. This will be posted on the NYSAC website tomorrow afternoon, and the slides will be there that we used today. And again, please feel free to contact the officials on today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us.